Just before we continue, today's video is sponsored by PLAUD. I don't know if you're like me, but you finish a meeting, your brain is full, your notes are scattered, somebody's already asking you for follow-ups. You're like, follow-ups on what? What's happening? I don't remember half the meeting. Well, good news, because that is where, I'll take it out of my pocket, is where PLAUD comes in. PLAUD is basically a digital secretary. All you have to do is you press this button to start taking notes, and it's got two modes. There's the first one, you have the lever slid up, which allows you to record a call. So if you're on the phone, it'll record the call and take notes for you, which is fantastic, or slide it down, and that's just passive mode. So if you're in a meeting, you can just leave it on the desk, everyone can be heard by it, and it identifies the speakers and it puts it into these fantastic actionable notes. In fact, my biggest use case of this is not in the talking points, so I don't know if they're okay with this. My biggest use case is just like random thoughts that come to me. I'll just press the button. And I know you could do it on the phone. You could like go into voice memos and I even tried assigning the action button on my phone to like voice memos, and then trying to get this to work like a year ago before we had PLAUD, and it was just a massive hassle. And it didn't have this technology to turn it into actually useful notes, so I'd have to go, even when I did manage to record something, I'd have to go back and listen to it and type it. It was insane. It's 2025, and then PLAUD came along and fixed everything. It's ridiculously easy to use. You just attach it to the back of your phone and you always have it with you. Plus, your data stays fully safe with end-to-end encryption, meeting global privacy standards. PLAUD Note is the best meeting secretary you'll ever. There's also Note Pro, which has advanced hardware. They couldn't actually send that to me in time, so I haven't tried it. Full transparency. They did send me the pin, which is one you clip on yourself, and that's awesome. I feel like it's like I'm a Star Trek nerd. It's a comm badge. You press it and you take a note. Anyway, hit the link in the description below, scan the QR code, and use my code for a great discount on some of PLAUD's selected products. Thank you to PLAUD AI for sponsoring, and now back to today's video.
On September the 7th, 1996, the most popular rapper in America, Tupac Shakur, was among the 17,000 people in attendance at the MGM Grand in Las Vegas who witnessed Mike Tyson destroy Bruce Seldon in a first-round knockout. Although that was one of the shortest heavyweight championship bouts in history, the night became far more infamous for what happened following the fight. After leaving the arena, Tupac's car stopped at a red light when a white Cadillac pulled up next to it and an unidentified man opened fire, hitting the rapper 4 times. Tupac was taken to the hospital, where he was placed on life support, but he died 6 days later at the age of just 25. The rapper's violent end was tragic, but perhaps not unexpected given his association with Death Row Records. At the peak of its popularity, Death Row Records was one of the most successful hip-hop record labels of all time. It was selling millions of albums every year and raking in hundreds of millions of dollars in profits while its artists were receiving heavy rotation on the airwaves. And behind it all was a man named Suge Knight, once described as the most feared man in hip-hop. Known for his close connections with the Bloods, Knight ran his label like a gang, with himself as the undisputed leader at the top. Intimidation, threats, beatings were the techniques that he used to conduct a business, and it was inevitable that eventually the bodies were going to start dropping. Death Row Records was the brainchild of Marion Hugh Knight Jr., better known to the world as Suge Knight. He was born in Compton, California in 1965, and when he was a kid, everyone called him Sugar Bear, which he shortened to Suge. Knight went to high school in Linwood, where he became a football star thanks in no small part to his imposing 188cm, 120kg body. That's 6'2", 265 pounds Americans. He continued his football career in college, playing for the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, UNLV, where he became Rookie of the Year and was named the team's defensive captain. Unsurprisingly, Knight hoped that a career as an NFL player was in his future, but those hopes were soon dashed. The difference between college and pro ball was just too great, and Knight didn't have what it takes to make it to the big leagues. He went undrafted during the 1987 NFL draft, but he got lucky. At the start of the season, the NFL Players Association went on strike. It only lasted a few weeks, but during that time, the NFL scrambled to assemble some ersatz teams from undrafted players and former college players and send them out to the gridiron. Suge Knight was one of those replacements, and he got to play 2 games as a member of the LA Rams before the strike ended. And thus Knight's football career ended with a severe whimper. So it was time for him to find something else to do. Growing up in Compton, he'd been exposed to street gangs since he was a child. The Bloods ruled his neighborhood, but they were constantly at war with LA's other major black gang, the Crips. Dangerous drug deals, bloody fistfights, and fatal drive-by shootings were a common occurrence that the people of Compton had learned to live with. But Knight didn't just learn to live with it, he embraced it. Later he said, "Compton's like the ocean. It's really pretty, but anytime something can happen, somebody getting eaten, somebody fighting, something's always going on." Although Knight himself never joined a gang, he had many friends who were Bloods. With them at his side, Knight grew bolder, colder, and more violent, and the man known as Sugar Bear turned out to not be quite as sweet as his moniker would suggest. His first troubles with the law came later that same year, in 1987, when he was arrested for domestic violence and violating a restraining order filed against him by his former girlfriend, Sharithra Golden. In the end, she dropped the charges and even married him a couple of years later. Knight's attitude towards women, though, never truly changed. Much later, in 2008, he was arrested on similar charges of assault and domestic violence after punching his girlfriend in the head and pulling a knife on her. What a lovely guy. Shortly after the attack on Golden, Knight went on a trip to Las Vegas. While there, he saw a Nissan Maxima that he absolutely needed to drive for some reason. The problem was that it already belonged to somebody else, who also happened to be in the car at the time. But this didn't deter Knight, who stole the car and shot the driver twice with his own gun, once in the leg, once in the wrist. The police arrested Knight later that same night. He was charged with attempted murder, grand theft auto, and use of a deadly weapon, but he must have had a hell of a lawyer because the charges were lowered to a misdemeanor, and Knight got off with a $1,000 fine. Holy shit. Who is that lawyer? The judge might have considered this an isolated incident, but it wasn't. It turned out it wasn't. With his NFL career in the rearview mirror, Knight needed to make money, so he put his intimidating frame to good use and acted as hired muscle. He worked security at local concerts, and then some friends got him a job at the LA Sports Arena. Soon enough, Knight was a bodyguard for singer Bobby Brown and made sure nobody bothered him while he was getting his groove on. Hitting the clubs every night with Brown introduced Suge to a new side of Los Angeles, the entertainment industry. He began meeting new people. Knight befriended rapper the DOC and switched to working as his bodyguard. It was a pretty easy gig. Suge had already established a reputation in Los Angeles as a dangerous man that you didn't want to mess with, but working security was small potatoes as far as he was concerned. Knight saw the music business as the place where the real money was, and he regarded the DOC as his introduction into that world. The two toyed with the idea of starting their own record label and made plans to launch Funky Enough Records. These fell through, though, when one of their partners backed out of the deal, but this didn't deter Knight. It only made him wait a little longer for the right opportunity. Suge realized that to put himself and his new label on the map, he needed to sign a big name right off the bat. And that name was Dr. Dre. The DOC made the introductions since they were both signed to the same label, Ruthless Records. At the time, Dr. Dre was probably the most successful music producer in hip-hop. He was part of a highly influential group called NWA, but all was not well within their ranks. In 1989, they catapulted gangster rap to the forefront of American culture with their album Straight Outta Compton, but things went quickly downhill thanks to disagreements over money. They felt the Ruthless Records founders, Jerry Heller and Eazy-E, were getting more than their fair share of the pie. The two original members of the NWA, Ice Cube and Arabian Prince, left in 1989, and the following year, Dr. Dre was fed up with Ruthless Records as well. He was ready to switch labels, but the problem was, he still had a contract. However, the execs at Ruthless Records were not prepared for Knight's way of doing things. In the world of gangster rap, everyone talked tough, but at the end of the day, most of them were performers putting on a show. They glorified a world of crime, where street violence was commonplace, but they didn't live it. Suge Knight, on the other hand, was meant to be the real deal, so he began waging a campaign of terror and intimidation on the Ruthless execs until they agreed to terminate Dre and DOC's contracts. It started with threatening phone calls, then came visits to the office where Knight was accompanied by multiple gang members, all visibly armed. Employees at Ruthless Records were afraid to go to work. Some quit their jobs. Label head honcho Jerry Heller had bodyguards with him at all times and kept a shotgun in his desk drawer. He didn't feel safe even in his own home. Heller later admitted to hiding at least 24 guns around the house should Knight and his goons make a surprise visit. His heart skipped a beat whenever a car drove slowly by his estate or when he heard the dogs barking. Eventually, Heller decided he couldn't live like that anymore and agreed to a deal with Knight. That left his partner, Eazy-E. According to him, he was tricked into a meeting that became more of a hostage situation. He thought he was going to see Dr. Dre, but when he opened the door, all he saw was Suge Knight and his armed thugs. This time, Knight made it clear that Eazy-E would either sign the releases or suffer the consequences, even telling him that he knew where Eazy's mother lived. Ultimately, Eazy-E signed the papers, and Dr. Dre, the DOC, plus a few other acts, were no longer a part of Ruthless Records. While all of this was happening, Knight also made moves on the legitimate side. He partnered with a man called Dick Griffey, who already had his own label called Solar Records. He knew the business and had connections. He got Sony on board because they wanted to work with Dr. Dre, so it looked like everybody was about to get a big fat paycheck. However, multiple lawsuits from Ruthless Records put a stop to that. After all the accusations made over how Suge Knight conducted business, Sony became wary of working with him and pulled out of the deal. Once again, Knight's plans fell to the wayside, but not for long. This time, he already had most things in place. He had several acts ready to sign. He had the big headliner in Dr. Dre. All he needed was a cash influx to get the label off the ground, and he decided that rapper Vanilla Ice would be the one to donate the necessary funds. This is a story that has reached mythical status in the music world, with multiple versions of it floating around. But one thing we know for sure: in 1990, Vanilla Ice released the album To the Extreme. Headlines by the ultra-popular single Ice Ice Baby, the album became a smash hit, but it seems that not everyone got their due. One person who claimed they got screwed was Mario Chocolate Johnson, a friend and collaborator of Suge Knight. To this day, he says that he wrote most of the songs on the album, including the mega hit Ice Ice Baby, but without being compensated fairly or getting writing credits. Knight decided to correct this omission the only way he knew how: through intimidation and coercion. Now look, if you've heard this story before, then you've probably heard the version, which ends with Suge Knight dangling Vanilla Ice over the balcony of his hotel room until he agreed to sign over a percentage of the royalties. However, everyone involved dismisses this as a fairy tale. But Vanilla Ice said in an interview that one night, as he returned to the hotel, he found Suge Knight and 5 other armed guys waiting for him in his room. Then Suge and Vanilla went out on the balcony alone for a private conversation, and Knight left with the percentages. The final round of funding came courtesy of convicted gangster Michael Harry O'Harris. Allegedly. Knight has always denied the connection, claiming all of his funding was obtained legitimately via deals with record companies such as Interscope and Sony. However it happened, Death Row was ready to launch. Once all the ducks were in a row, success came really fast to Death Row Records. In 1992, Dr. Dre released his first solo album, The Chronic, which went triple platinum. In 1993, Dre's protege, Snoop Dogg, released his debut album, Doggy Style, which sold even better and went quadruple platinum. Meanwhile, other Death Row artists such as the Pound Dog, Nate Dogg, and Michael Lee were all getting plenty of airplay. And then in 1995, Death Row Records signed one of the biggest names in hip-hop, Tupac. He released the album All Eyes on Me the following year, which became one of the greatest rap albums in history and was certified diamond. In just a few short years, Death Row Records had reached the peak of the hip-hop world, but its artists seemed to be in the headlines for their crimes almost as much as their music. Multiple women had accused Dr. Dre of abuse and violence, including rapper D. Barnes and his former girlfriend and label mate, Michelle Lee. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg was charged with murder in 1993 after his bodyguard killed a rival gang member and was acquitted after a highly publicized 3-year trial. And Tupac was serving time at the Clinton Correctional Facility when he signed with Death Row, having been convicted of first-degree abuse. But of course, their actions paled in comparison to those of the man in charge. Despite becoming a successful businessman, Suge Knight had absolutely no intention of changing his ways. In 1992, a rapping duo consisting of George and Linwood Stanley launched a civil suit against Knight, claiming that he forced them on their knees at gunpoint and then pistol-whipped them, all because they used an office phone without permission. Eventually, the two sides reached a settlement, and Suge got probation. In 1993, he was named as the 34th defendant in a drug distribution ring, but was only convicted for gun possession and given more probation. At this point, Knight must have felt a bit untouchable. Multiple times he'd been in serious trouble with the law, and every time he walked away a free man. On March 13, 1995, Death Row Records hosted an after-party at the El Rey Theatre following the Soul Train Music Awards. In attendance were celebrities, music industry bigwigs, and since this was a Death Row event, gang members. Since both Bloods and Crips were based in Los Angeles, it was common for them to attend the same events. Usually they managed to get along while there was a party and everyone was feeling good, but every now and then someone said the wrong thing and things quickly deteriorated. This night was one of the latter. A man named Kelly Jameson, a member of the Rolling 60s Crips, got into an argument with Death Row record producer DJ Quick. 8 to 10 of Quick's friends, all members of the Blood, surrounded Jameson and began beating him, stomping on him numerous times until he stopped moving. The LAPD arrived in full riot gear and Jameson was rushed to the hospital, but he died the following day. Nobody was charged with his murder. Suge proudly flaunted his close ties to the Bloods. He frequently wore red outfits in public and threw up gang signs, especially when the cameras were rolling. In a world based around the glorification of street violence and gang life, Suge Knight wanted everyone to know that it wasn't just a fantasy when it came to him, he was legit. Knight took a personal dislike to fellow infamous hip-hop mogul Sean Combs, aka Diddy, taking issue with the latter's tendency to rap and dance in his artists' videos. In August 1995, Knight publicly called Diddy out on stage at the Source Awards, stating, "Any artist out there that want to be an artist and stay a star and don't have to worry about the executive producer trying to be in all the videos, all on the record, dancing, come to death row." Tensions already existed between the East Coast and the West Coast rap scenes, but Suge's comments were seen as the shot that fully ignited the feud. From then on, there was a heated rivalry between Death Row Records and Diddy's Bad Boy Entertainment. When it came to the music, the feud was mainly carried out by each company's top star. In the case of Death Row, that was Tupac, and for Bad Boy Records, it was the notorious B.I.G., or just Biggie to you and me. But the enmity between the two sides went far beyond a few disses on a rap track, and behind the scenes, out in the streets, it was Suge Knight and Diddy who were ready to take the rivalry to deadly extremes. A month after Knight called out Diddy at the Source Awards, both entourages attended a party at the Platinum House in Atlanta. Unsurprisingly, they got into a heated argument. Minutes later, they took the fight outside where it escalated, and then a gunshot was heard. Afterward, a man named Jai Hassan Jamal Robles, aka Big Jake, collapsed to the floor bleeding. He was a 24-year-old member of the Bloods and a friend and bodyguard of Suge Knight. He was taken to the hospital, but he died a week later. Once again, no charges were brought, but police documents later revealed that several fingers all pointed in the same direction at Anthony Wolf Jones, a bodyguard for Diddy who acted more like an enforcer and who faced the same fate in 2003 when he too was gunned down in front of a club in Atlanta. Now, 1996 was a disastrous year for Death Row Records. One might even call it the beginning of the end for them. A lot of the artists were fed up with Suge Knight. Some felt that they weren't being fairly compensated. Others simply had had enough of the gangster stuff. Rapping about that lifestyle and actually living it, they were two really different things. As Knight and his entourage of gang members became more and more violent, anybody closely associated with them was likely to end up either dead or in prison. An exodus occurred, highlighted by the departure of the label's biggest producer, Dr. Dre, who founded his own company, Aftermath Entertainment. Corrupt, one of the members of the Dog Pound, followed. Snoop wanted to leave too, but he had to wait until 1998 due to his contract. Other hitmakers for the label, such as DOC and Warren G, had already departed and found greener pastures. But it was about to get a lot worse. Now we arrive at the event we mentioned at the beginning of the video, September the 7th, 1996, when Tupac Shakur was shot just outside the Las Vegas Strip after leaving the Tyson fight. As always, the Death Row crew showed up in heavy numbers. They departed the arena, heading for Knight's new Las Vegas hotspot, Club 662. They were driving in a convoy, but only two people were in Tupac's 1996 BMW. He was in the passenger seat, and Suge Knight was behind the wheel. As we said, a white Cadillac pulled up on the passenger side at a red light, and someone inside opened fire. Tupac tried jumping into the backseat for cover, but he was hit by 4 bullets, one of them piercing his lungs. Knight, meanwhile, only got hit by bullet fragments that caused some grazing wounds. Following Tupac's death, the investigation into his murder didn't yield any immediate results. This led to rumors, hypotheses, and conspiracies over who was responsible for the rapper's untimely demise. Many fingers pointed at Tupac's musical rival, the notorious B.I.G., who supposedly hired a gang of Crips to do his dirty work. One LA Times investigative report asserted that not only did Biggie pay the shooters $1 million, but that he even supplied them with the gun. Obviously, the East Coast rapper denied any involvement and provided witness testimonies that he was in New York the night of the hit, not Las Vegas. Suge Knight claimed decades later that he knew exactly who killed Tupac and that he had been the real target as part of a planned coup to take over Death Row Records. But he wasn't saying who. Knight himself has been brought up as a possible suspect. The idea was that Knight wanted Tupac dead because the rapper wanted to leave Death Row just like Dre and Snoop. If this was true, however, we're inclined to think that Knight might have planned a hit when he wasn't in the line of fire. And of course, we can't leave out the most popular conspiracy theory, which claims that Tupac is still alive, having followed in the footsteps of Elvis and Andy Kaufman, faking his own death. The reality is, the police were on the right track from the beginning. But a few fumbles and lack of evidence derailed the investigation, and it wasn't until decades after the murder that the likeliest scenario revealed itself, that Tupac was another victim of the ongoing feud between the Bloods and the Crips. Now, to get a fuller picture, we first have to go back to a few months before the shooting to the Lakewood Mall in California. That was where 3 members of the Bloods were spending the day when they got jumped by a larger gang of Crips, got beaten and robbed. One of the victims was Trey Lane, a member of Suge Knight's entourage. The two were close. So close, in fact, that Knight had gifted him a gold chain with a Death Row logo medallion studded with diamonds, which was stolen from him during the attack. Fast forward to the day of the fight. A few hours before the shooting, Trey Lane was with Tupac and the rest of the Death Row crew inside the MGM Grand when he recognized one of the men who jumped him, a member of the Southside Compton Crips, Orlando Anderson. The guys from Death Row walked up to him and gave him the beating of a lifetime right there in the hotel. And this whole thing was caught on CCTV, with Tupac said to have thrown the first punch. So, that was the motivation behind the hit, retaliation for the attack. The police interviewed Orlando Anderson along with numerous other gang members, but did not charge him with anything. Nor will they ever charge him, as Orlando Anderson was killed in an unrelated shootout just 2 years later. For a long time, it looked like this was all we were going to get for Tupac's death, a plausible story but no official verdict. But then there was an unexpected breakthrough. In September 2023, police announced the arrest of Dwayne "Kefe D" Davis in connection with the rapper's murder. For whatever reason, Davis started talking about the night in question. He even released a memoir in 2019. Davis was Orlando Anderson's uncle, and he claimed that there were 4 people in the white Cadillac that night, themselves plus 2 men named Terrence Brown and Andre Smith. He refused to ID the shooter, though, not that it would matter much since the other 3 were all dead. Now that he'd been arrested, Davis had walked back his claims, even asserting that he never read, let alone wrote, his memoir. Despite his protests of innocence, Dwayne Davis has been charged with murder, and his trial is scheduled to begin in early 2026. Tupac's death was a heavy blow for Death Row Records, but things were about to get even worse for Suge Knight. After years of continuously flaunting the law and getting away with it, he finally ran into a judge who said, "Not this time, dude." In October 1996, a month after Tupac's murder, Knight was arrested for the beating on Orlando Anderson in the MGM Grand. He was already on parole, so the judge showed no leniency and sentenced Suge Knight to 9 years in prison. With him behind bars, Death Row Records suffered a slow but inevitable demise. All of its most popular artists were gone. New musicians came along, but they could never find the same success, and the only Death Row releases to go platinum from then on were Tupac's posthumous albums. The music might have stopped coming out of Death Row, but the trail of bodies that the label left in its wake continued to grow. Just 6 months after Tupac's death, the world of hip-hop was stunned again when his former rival, the notorious B.I.G., was also assassinated in an almost identical scenario. On March the 8th, 1997, Biggie, Diddy, and the rest of the Bad Boy entourage attended an after-party following the Soul Train Music Awards held at the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. They left around 12:30 a.m., piling into 2 Chevrolet Suburbans. Biggie was sitting in the front passenger seat, same as Tupac. At a red light, a dark Chevy Impala pulled up next to the passenger side. The driver took out a 9mm pistol and fired 6 shots into the Suburban where Biggie was sitting before speeding off into the night. The rapper was hit 4 times. Again, same as Tupac. 3 of the shots were non-fatal, but 1 bullet pierced his colon, liver, heart, and left lung before stopping in his left shoulder. There's nothing the doctors could do. Biggie died soon after arriving at the hospital, aged 24. The investigation into the New York rapper's murder was fraught with controversy and accusations of corruption and incompetence, perhaps even more so than his West Coast rival, since there were numerous rumors that the LAPD was involved. That's what Biggie's family believed, and they filed 2 wrongful death lawsuits against the city of Los Angeles, implicating 1 or more police officers. The man most often at the center of this conspiracy is David Mack, a Los Angeles cop who was one of the central figures in the infamous rampant corruption scandal that rocked the LAPD in the years following Biggie's murder. Mack, alongside fellow LAPD officer Kevin Gaines, had connections not only to the Bloods, but to Suge Knight directly. Hell, Gaines was even dating Suge's ex-wife. They worked security for Death Row Records alongside gang members on occasion. Mack was arrested in December 1997 and sentenced to 14 years in prison for bank robbery, while Gaines was killed by an undercover cop just 9 days after Biggie's death. Multiple people have concluded that David Mack and a close associate named Amir Muhammad were the men responsible for Biggie's murder, acting on orders from Suge Knight. This includes the detective who originally handled the investigation, Russell Poole, who said that he was prevented by his superiors from looking too closely into Mack or any other corrupt cops. An FBI report from 2003 supported a similar theory, although it identified Amir Muhammad as the triggerman, not David Mack. An investigation by another detective revealed a different shooter, but a similar scenario. He believed that Biggie's killer was a man named Wardell Poochie Foes. He too was a member of the Bloods with close ties to Suge Knight and supposedly acted on the latter's orders. And like so many other names that we've already mentioned today, Foes met a violent and premature end when he was killed in a shootout in 2003. In 2001, Suge Knight was released after 5 years in prison. Any notions that he might be a reformed man were quickly dismissed. In 2002, he spent another 60 days in jail for violating his parole by consorting with gang members. In 2003, Knight was sentenced to another 10 months in prison for assaulting a parking lot attendant. Meanwhile, the bodies around him kept piling up. On April 3, 2002, one of his closest friends and bodyguards, Alton Buntree McDonald, was gunned down at a gas station. A few months later, another close friend named Harry Hendog Smith, the man who designed the Death Row logo, was shot 6 times while sitting in his Jeep. And as we already said, in 2003, Wardell Foes, suspected gunman in Biggie's murder, was also killed. All of these deaths are believed to stem from a gang war between rival sets of the Bloods that Suge used to employ. Knight himself was also shot on 2 occasions, in 2005 at a party in Miami and in 2014 inside a nightclub in West Hollywood. Both times he survived with minor injuries and refused to cooperate with the police. A few more minor scuffles with the law followed, but the big one came in 2015. Director Gary F. Gray was filming a biographical drama about the NWA called Straight Outta Compton, and Suge Knight wasn't happy with how he was being portrayed in the movie. On January the 29th, he drove up to a restaurant where they were shooting a scene and got into an argument with a man called Clee Sloan. Knight was told to leave, but he had another idea in mind and charged his 2-ton F-150 Raptor into Sloan and another man named Terry Carter, running them both over before speeding away. Sloan survived his injuries. Carter died within the hour. Knight's lawyer tried to argue that it was self-defense because Sloan had a gun, but nobody was buying that. Knight was convicted of voluntary manslaughter, and because it was his 3rd strike in California, he was sentenced to 28 years in prison. Suge Knight's downfall was complete, but not the downfall of Death Row Records. The label declared bankruptcy in 2006, but experienced an unexpected revival in 2022 when Snoop Dogg announced that he had bought Death Row and was bringing it back. As to his motivations, Snoop said that it was about unfinished business and protecting his legacy, but also about injecting some life and happy times into Death Row after so much death. Thank you for watching.